Welcome back. You're listening to Cybersecurity Viewpoints with Rob Carey, sponsored by Vencor on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. I'm your moderator, Jason Miller, and my guest, of course, is Rob Carey, the Vice President of Navy and Marine Corps Programs for Vencor. Now, Rob, before break, we were talking about the cyber sprint and the progress it did make, but you gave us a little bit of a heads up of where it needs to go next. You mentioned a couple keywords here, data analytics. I think that's one of them. You talked about a little bit of the insider threat. Let me start with data analytics and as the starting point for what happens next, because we know that the OMB sprint did one thing, focused on a short period of time on a specific set of issues, but now as I've heard the folks from OMB and Tony Scott, the federal CIO, say, it's time for the marathon.
Yeah, and that's really a good way to cover it. That was actually the word I was going to use. The sprint part's over. Now we have to start running and stay running, keep investments at the proper levels, and bring in the tools that help us make sense of these terabytes of data at a time that are the indicators of anomalous behavior on the network, right? So this is all about not worrying about signatures as much, worrying about behavioral changes on the network. What are the norms? What are the abnorms? And discerning them, and then making real-time changes to the network and stopping processes when they need to be stopped. People sort of fear that a little bit, that the machines can shut the network down for fear of breaking the business. But frankly, there's a trade-off here between, do you want to break the business for a day, or do you want to have your accounts hacked? Right, you want to lose all your data, and that's a hard trade for both government leaders and industry leaders to make.
And I think that's one of the issues that came up during the OPM data breach, during the hearings in the Post, is, hey, OPM, you had 11 systems without an authority to operate. Why don't you just shut them down? And the discussion always goes back to, well, if we shut them down, what does that do to getting, federal retirees, which you're one of them, your benefit checks, or getting, making sure that there's other things that are taken care of. How do you kind of look at that trade? How do you use that data to make those decisions of again, risk management?
Well, if you look at the stats and facts around some of these hacks and breaches, they are really expensive. They take the system down anyway. And so to take it down in a controlled manner versus taking it down in an uncontrolled manner, to me, the answer is pretty obvious, right? I'd rather control the takedown, and I'd rather be able to just then deal with it. When we get to technologies that can actually sandbox malware, sidetrack it, keep resilience flowing, so sort of route the trons in another path and keep the processes moving, that's nirvana right there. We're not there yet, but at the end of the day, if we don't shut down networks when things happen or before they actually manifest themselves, presuming we've detected the behavior, I think we then live the consequence on the other side, and that's orders of magnitude more expensive and painful to clean up.
I think that's actually a really interesting point, because when the reactive, whenever an agency, an organization, whoever reacts, they tend to have a much harder time than if they're in front of it. I mean, I remember a recent event, I want to say at the Navy, which your old stomping grounds, I think this after you left though, where they had a cyber attack and they didn't want to talk about it, and they didn't want to, there's nothing that came out until months and months later, and when the things finally came out, they said, well, we found out about it, we stopped the bleeding, if you will, and we fixed this problems, and now we're moving on. And it's a lot different than, for instance, the OPM hack, just as a comparison, it took them much longer to stop the bleeding, and then when you realize how bad the bleeding was, unfortunately, the patient was much sicker.
Right.
And I think the controlled takedown versus the uncontrolled one.
Well, again, both of those presume detection, right? That you saw it, that you can take an action, or your automated system could take an action. The challenge with some of the major hacks is they occurred months, up to many months, before somebody said, hey, that process, something's wrong there. And so through an analyst view and tools, we found it out. So that's the problem right there. In the internet age, you cannot be reliant upon an analyst and a tool making a save here. There are millions of attacks that occur every second, and there are how many people sitting behind plates of glass doing analytics on cyber incidents, determining that's a problem or that's not a problem. And that's the challenge here. So we have got to get ahead, skate to where the puck's going to be, to your ice hockey tune, as opposed to chasing it, which is what we're doing.
And in many ways, that's what something like the CTIC is doing, the the Cybersecurity Threat Integration Center that's just being stood up now from the White House and those in the intelligence. One thing that's missing from this conversation along the cyber sprint seems to be, and I think you mentioned it a little bit, is the accountability. Talk a little bit about why that is missing from this conversation.
It's a really good question, because what I don't see is who is got the rose pin on their chest, and just like anything else, if they don't get it done, then they find somebody else. We seem to want to go find a semblance of contributing factors that led to this challenge. I didn't have enough money, I didn't know enough this, I didn't know enough that. But accountability hasn't been present in this case, and as we move into the information age deeper and further, I personally think accountability is even more needed to drive the ability to make changes and say, if I don't do it, then here's what happens. Mobile devices continue to explode, and their capabilities continue to explode, as you would imagine, and that's all good. The downside is they're now RF devices representative of the network running around the globe uncontrolled for the most part. And so someone has to say, I understand what's going on in my network, and within some realm of reason, I have control of it, and I'm responsible for making the calls.
Where does the Federal Information Technology Reform Act, FITARA, where does that fall into this? Because a lot of this is around supposed to be the accountability when it comes to acquisition, because it's acquisition reform, but cyber plays into the acquisition piece too. I mean, they are hand in hand.
It does, and I think FITARA is well intended to deliver accountability to CIOs and other folks in the chain to make sure that they can report up to their agency head what's going on. So I think it's a step in the right direction. And the downside is that I don't know that the ecosystem supports that in the macro. So I sort of don't see the acquisition system supporting the ability of the CIO to influence outcomes when it counts, because after all, most agencies have an acquisition system that is separate and distinct from the information technology management processes.
When we talk FITARA, when we talk accountability, from your experience at the Navy and as the principal deputy CIO for DoD, was there that accountability at DoD as well? I mean, was the CIO of DoD the hey, fix this, or NSA, or whom?
Sort of.
Sort of.
I would say not completely, because again, there's an acquisition leader, Frank Kendall, and there's a CIO, Terry Halverson, today. And so they each have complementary roles to deliver outcomes on behalf of the Secretary and the rest of the department. The challenge that I see is that the lines tend to cross at times, and that's where, again, it becomes difficult in a negotiation to move forward. And so again, when you look at who's accountable, you really can't find that one person. And frankly, in this country, my sense is we're very good at holding one person accountable. We're not really good at holding 2 and 3 and 4, because immediately fingers start to point.
Right. And I think that's what's missing from this conversation, because if you think about somebody like the Target hack, someone lost their job because of that.
That's right.
And
That's right.
when government, with the OPM hack, the director of OPM lost their job, but I'm not sure it's the same one-for-one trade. We're going to take a quick break. You're listening to the Cybersecurity Viewpoints with Rob Carey, sponsored by Vencor, on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM.